Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Wild Live. Thank you so much for those of you that have joined us on Wild Live these last few months. We have a growing cohort of joining and tuning in for Wild Live each time, with thousands of people watching these broadcasts after they've been broadcast as well. There's a real growing cohort of people that are following Wild Lives as we discuss these issues that really matter for nature. So thank you so much for doing that. And with lots of suggestions about topics for future Wild Lives. But we decided for this one that we had to focus on something that is really a huge issue at the moment, and that is the future planning and the planning system. It's one of those issues that, planning sometimes sounds a bit dull, doesn't it? Until it affects you and where you live and close to where you live. And right now, the government is planning reform of the planning system. And it's a bit contentious. Remember earlier in the summer, Boris Johnson talked about the need for project speed, the need for us to move much faster on development and to actually make sure we stop the new counting that gets in the way of development and indeed move much faster in building houses. And he said one of the problems that was getting in the way of building those houses was the planning system, and therefore we needed reform. That's on one side of the argument. On the other side of the argument, there are many people believe planning controls are absolutely essential to make sure that we build not just beautifully, but also sustainably and in harmony with nature. And we're going to absolutely look at this topic tonight, and also issues around local democracy as well. But before we start, I thought it would kind of be interesting. These whole discussions, these debates we've been having around planning over the last few months across the sector and with the public and in amongst politicians remind me, if it hasn't you, it reminded me of the first chapter of one of my favorite books, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you're familiar with it, you might well be. It's when planet Earth gets destroyed by the Vogons to make way for a new intergalactic highway. And the Vogons arrive and they're about to demolish planet Earth, and us Earthlings suddenly realize this is about to happen and start complaining about it. And the Vogons respond. There's no point acting all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years. So you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now. So tonight, we're going to really explore whether the government's plans on planning reform actually are about us living more sustainably, or indeed whether they perhaps threaten the future of our planet by allowing unsustainable development and actually locking people out of the planning system. And we have a fantastic panel of people that are going to help us through that. I'm delighted to say, joining us tonight, we have Wayne Hemingway, who was one of the founders of the fashion brand Red or Dead, but is now leads up Hemingway Design and is a designer and member of the Design Council Trustee Board. He'd been known to many of you, and Wayne, we're absolutely delighted you could join us tonight. We also have Emma Greenwood, who's Youth MP for Bury and a Youth Council member for Lancashire Wildlife Trust. 16-year-old Youth MP for Bury. Delighted, Emma, that you're able to join us as well and give that perspective from young people who have just been so passionate in campaigning around the climate and ecological emergency over the last few years. Delighted also that we have a hugely key person on this from within government. We have Simon Gallagher, who's Director of Planning at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I would summarise the most senior civil servant on this issue and absolutely at the centre of the debates around planning reform. Not a politician, a civil servant. So we can't blame him for everything the politicians say, but he will absolutely have control and key influence over where we go with planning reform. We also have Rebecca Taylor, architect and partner with JTP, that we can have the architecture profession represented tonight, and Rebecca will bring great skill and experience to this discussion. And then we have our very own Roger Mortlock, who's Chief Executive of Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust and has pioneered a lot of the work within the Wildlife Trust and beyond about actually how housing can be built in a way that is in harmony with nature. So I'm going to go to each of the panelists to kick us off. I'm going to start with you, Roger, first, if we can, to really just give us a brief overview, 4 minutes from each of the panelists, about really what you think is needed from planning to deliver for nature. And actually, do you think that the government's proposals for planning reform actually will do the job at the moment? or are there changes needed? Roger, kick us off.
Cheers, Craig, and great to be here. I want to talk a little bit, we're going to see a video in a second about an initiative we've started in Gloucestershire, but now I'm delighted is working right around the UK, called Building with Nature. And it started about 5 or 6 years ago when we embarked on setting a fairly audacious goal about setting up the first green infrastructure benchmark. So we wanted to define what quality meant. There was a lot of guidance around in various planning documents, but a lot of local authorities really confused about what quality green infrastructure meant. We also wanted for a benchmark to cover the whole of the planning process, from planning, from design, right the way through to long-term management and maintenance. And we're doing it now, which is great. So we've accredited through the scheme around 60,000 homes across the UK, and we've got a really active standards board with the people who helped to design this, so developers and planners working together with us. But why did we do this? Well, I think one of the things we did, I was getting really bored at looking at planning applications too late in the process. That actually, by the time a lot of planning applications land on our desks at Wildlife Trust, the plans have gone too far, and we wanted to find a way that we could engage much earlier in the process. So we knew that early engagement was key, but we didn't quite have the mechanism to do so. So that was one reason. The other thing is that long-term management and maintenance were often cut out of the plans. I heard talking to one of our Building with Nature pioneers in Cornwall Wildlife Trust earlier today, and in 2018, only 60% of the environment and wildlife features that were proposed in planning applications were actually delivered. Now that's quite similar to what we've experienced, and it's so depressing to fight so hard for things that are delivered in a planning application but then are not delivered. So we wanted to have a system that made sure and put more pressure on those things actually coming out. And finally, we wanted some guidance that had a shared definition of quality. One of the things we discovered straight up was that there was huge common cause. I spent a big chunk of my career working in public health in the NHS before it moved into local authorities, and we used to comment on planning applications, and we were ignored too. So other people, I talked to the police, they were saying no one listens to us. So there was this whole bunch of people who were really dedicated to, who I'm sure the planners were listening to. I've developed so much respect for planners who are really struggling through resources in local authorities. But when we looked and talked to health professionals, when we talked to our local enterprise partnership, when we talked to people in our county and beyond who are worried about social justice and social cohesion, when we talked with our own interests around climate change and biodiversity loss, we realized that the definition of what a good place was pretty much shared. And so when we started creating these standards around building with nature, we started creating this shared framework, we realized that it was real harmonization, that there was huge common cause there. So what have we learned? I guess we're coming out at the end of this, and one of the things we've really learned is, and one of the things developers tell us all the time, is that having this shared framework where it's working, and we accredit both planning documents, but also crucially developments themselves, that there's a huge reduction in planning uncertainty. So developers love that. It means they've got some certainty, but so it's also helped us to support and develop those staff working in local authorities who sometimes are worried about how to handle some of these big issues that green infrastructure covers. And it helps, most importantly for us in the Wildlife Trust, us to secure these benefits. So I think it's worth saying, from a Wildlife Trust view, we're worried about some of these reforms. Some of the principles around zoning are really interesting. Zoning has worked in some other countries. We think there's a zone missing. We think there's a zone which is missing for nature's recovery. We think there should be a wild belt. So we might want to talk about that more. And we think wildlife recovery and easy access to nature for people need to be much more at the heart of these reforms. They're in there, but they're not integrated in the way we want to see. And we don't want to see any rowback on those policies and standards for nature protection. There's 3 zones, which we'll hear about today, that are being proposed in the reforms, but all zones need to be at supporting nature's recovery. So I'm sure we'll come on to talk about the detail. I think we've got a little video about building with nature, but probably that's all for me for an introduction.
Thanks, Roger. Just before we go to the video, we're having loads of questions coming in already. So we had one from Christine Standen. It sounds like it's good just to get a few sentences from you on this before we go to the video. Christine was asking, can you just tell us about the protections in place now for the following categories of land: for areas of outstanding natural beauty, conservation villages, sites of special scientific interest, protections in place for streams or rivers, or excess demand on these natural environments, on sewage and wastewater and water abstraction? I mean, just how good are those protections at the moment? Are they good enough or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying that we've got some good protected areas across the country. So certainly in our national parks and in our AONBs, development has got some constraints around it, and that it doesn't mean you can't ever develop in those areas, but they're those protected areas. But as we've talked about in the Wildlife Trust movement, those places aren't always delivering the maximum goals for nature. We've also in our SSSI network, we've got some fantastic SSSIs, and it is, SSSI are very, very difficult for people to develop on, thank goodness. But many of our SSSIs are failing, and one of the reasons they're failing is because they don't have a connectivity within the wider landscape. And so one of the things I think, by looking at these fragments, whether it be SSSIs or other areas that have been designated, doesn't quite answer the challenge that we have in the Wildlife Trust, where we're really championing a nature recovery network, is that nature needs space. It needs space at scale, and it needs space for nature to move around. So that this sense of looking at planning in isolation to the broader networks, not just in terms of those special places. We in the Wildlife Trust have, as you keep saying, Craig, it's a brilliant quote, more nature reserves than McDonald's. But actually, the nature reserves, they're isolated fragments. What we've got to do is think about the planning reform in the context of nature's recovery more broadly, and linking up those fantastic areas where things are good into a much broader landscape.
Thank you, Roger. And just to clarify, more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants, about 1,000 more. And we're not aware of McDonald's having nature reserves, but you never know. So let's look now about how the work that we've been doing, and Roger has been pioneering for the Wildlife Trust around building with nature.
We're putting nature at the heart of development in a way that works for people and for wildlife. The UK is building hundreds of thousands of homes. These must be better for wildlife, better for our climate, and better for people's health. That's why we came together to create Building with Nature, a how-to guide for developers.
By introducing a set of quality standards around well-being, water and wildlife, Building with Nature will help to launch a new generation of development which raises the bar for industry, showing how to build for people and wildlife.
We have accredited schemes across the UK. We now need everyone to be building with nature.
So that shows that at the Wildlife Trust, we do think you can have development, you can build in a way that helps put nature in recovery, but only if we do it right. So very clear that that's what we're thinking. But I think we know that when we're talking about building, when we're talking about development, it's as much for the next generation as just us here and people like me, older people like me. So actually really important to hear from younger people. And of course, what we've seen over the last few years in particular is young people around the world really standing up and taking action to tackle the climate and ecological emergency. All very exciting, but you wouldn't really associate young people caring very much perhaps about planning and the planning system, but I think they do, we're hearing, and delighted that tonight we've got Emma Greenwood joining us. Emma is Youth MP for Bury and also a member of the Youth Council for the wonderful Lancashire Wildlife Trust. So Emma, planning, why are you interested in planning?
Yes, it's a very good question. Obviously, as you said before, I'm 16, so it's not normally something you would correlate with someone 16 being interested in. But if you speak to anyone my age, we're all really interested in property. It's becoming harder and harder for young people to get on the property ladder. And in our future, it's looking even more difficult that we'll ever be homeowners, we'll normally be renters, and if we can get housing at all. And the other thing we're seeing is the increase in flooding. Over between now and 2050, we're said to get 10% increase in rainfall. Obviously, sea levels are rising, rivers are bursting, these kind of once in a generation events that somehow seem to happen every year, where houses are being washed away. And we as young people are then going, hang on, where is our housing going to come from? And in a sense, over lockdown, we've seen how important nature is for our well-being. And I think when we've done developments in the past, it's often been very centered around building on nature and dominating it, whereas what we've seen is that in cities people have really struggled, because if you hadn't had a natural space to go to get some kind of peace of mind, to go to exercise, it's become intrinsic. It's a part of our daily well-being, and kind of the COVID-19 crisis, I would say, has really shown that to us. So what we're now thinking as young people is that cities and urban areas are being kind of made out of purely concrete, with a very little focus around the environment and biodiversity, and that aspect which so many of us now think is kind of intrinsic in our day-to-day life to ensure our mental well-being. So developments as they're going forward now and how the government are doing them aren't sustainable for our future and won't be what we want. The regulations that are in place aren't putting enough emphasis on ensuring there is that green space there, and that our buildings are integrating the environment into them instead of trying to dominate them. And as a young person, it's quite scary, because obviously I can't vote, so I can't have a say on any of this. And the government are kind of ploughing on with these houses that may be taken away by sea level rise or by the increase in rainfall by the time I even get to own a home. And it's a really scary fact knowing that, because I don't know that when I'm older, housing will be an accessible option for me, and that's going to be something that kind of 16-year-olds are having to worry about. But the government aren't putting the contingencies in place to ensure that we have safe and accessible housing for all young people when there kind of eventually come times to buy houses.
Great, thank you, Emma. Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I mean, it is a dilemma, isn't it? In one sense, people talk about the need for new houses. I think no one on the panel tonight is going to argue that we don't need new houses, and yet we are in an emergency, a climate emergency. And in fact, as youth around the world has been reminding everyone over the last 2-3 years, just that dilemma. I mean, you've talked about it there, how we kind of grapple those. But what do you find in the kind of conversations with, other young people about just how to balance those, how to integrate them, just actually how do you hear that expressed from others?
Yeah, a lot of the time it's the lack of green spaces. It's just really kind of becoming very evident. We're building houses on much smaller plots of land and trying to kind of cram them in on these small plots. And it just isn't a sustainable way to go forward, because covering everything in concrete means water's got nowhere to go. It increases flooding. It's this intrinsic network of consequences that just doesn't seem to be being evaluated. It always seems to be a second thought. And in the end, we're going to be the people dealing with those second thoughts, and they're all going to pile onto our generation. And what we need the government to do is to realise that nature and humans and nature need to exist coexist, because one without the other, it just won't work. And so we need to make sure that when we're building developments, it's about ensuring that nature is in our everyday lives and that we're looking after it and coexisting with it instead of trying to dominate it, because in the end, that just is not a sustainable way that my future is going to be able to happen.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Emma. We're delighted you'll be able to contribute to this discussion tonight. Also delighted to introduce our next panelist, who's Wayne Hemingway. Wayne will be known to many of you as one of the founders of Red or Dead, the fashion label, but also, of course, he leads Hemingway Design, and in that has been doing a huge amount of work around the design of our built environment. Hugely successful career in this whole kind of area. For example, also one of the London mayors, supporting the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, as a design advocate. So, Wayne, you kind of are the epitome of talking about good design and the need for good design in the built environment and in fashion as well. Tell me this, and I should say Wayne's travelling at the moment, so apologies for the connection, but we're confident it should work. It should be working at the moment. But delighted you can join us, Wayne. What do you think we need from the planning system to really ensure beautiful and sustainable design? And why is that so important?
Well,
go ahead, Wayne.
Is my connection all right now? I'm going through a slight. Yeah,
I think it's working. Go ahead.
The first thing we need, that we need to think about is bringing planning back to a heroic form, really. And it was good to hear young Emma, 16-year-old, interested in that and saying some very intelligent and sensible things. The problem is that planning has been denigrated and degraded for a long time now, to the point where it seems to be a dirty word, and as a result of that as well, there aren't enough young people like Emma going into it with the passion to make a difference. And really, it comes down to two things in the end. Boris Johnson has been saying build, 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 famously a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, and really it should be plan before we actually think about build. And if we're ever going to value land for its real value, which is obviously land is not a finite resource, and the environment is not a finite resource. If we're going to somehow change the market, and the market at the moment is absolutely utterly broken in favour of the big developers to an extent, but more in terms of the farmers who own the land. So, for example, I'm being driven. I'm not driving, as you can see. My hands are there. Driving around the M25, you'll where I passed fairly recently, you'll have seen. I saw acres of farmland on either side of big chunks of the M25. If the value of that land as farming or as forest or as natural land would be a maximum of £10,000 a hectare. I think that's, I don't think it's an acre, it might be a hectare, but whatever. But if that could be transformed into land that you could build houses on, it could get an uplift of up to 200 times. Now, the problem with that is that you'd have to be, and there are some very purposeful and values-driven landowners, but you have to be purposeful and values-driven to not take that uplift. And so all the time, people are trying to make a killing that will set up their families for a long time and set up for generations ahead by selling land. And remember that builders want greenfield sites because it's the easiest to sell. And so what could happen and what should happen should be an intervention this can only come from a legal focus from central government, and then backed up by a planning process where you can get a maximum uplift of might be
So we seem to have had a breakup with Wayne's connection now, unfortunately. I imagine we're going to get him back shortly. So just while we're waiting, there we go. No, we seem to be losing.
Am I back now?
I think you're back now, Wayne. Give it another go.
Okay. So basically, we need to intervene in the land value market and put caps on the land uplift. That can immediately change everything. It can start to make greenfield sites less valuable, and that means there's not a rush to build on our greenfield sites. It also means that more money can come back in to do rewilding and all of that kind of thing. Now, the other thing that we must take into account right now is COVID has accelerated and changed young people's opinions about homes, and about new homes. So for a long time, we've had a rush of people to live in cities for all the values that a lot of people know about cities, and why I as an 18-year-old moved to London, and why cities are still a big draw to young people. But COVID has changed all that. In cities for a while, we've been cramming young people into places without outdoor space, without balconies, without access to the things that we all found how much we need all of that natural environment during COVID. And there's just been we were part of this research. We've just worked with a big developer and with Ipsos Mori on an enormous piece of research looking at the views of millennials, Gen Zs and Gen Alphas. That's basically the three generations from Emma right up to just under 40. And I would worry if I was you, because
I
the
think we've
research has
lost.
shown genuinely want that fails. So,
Carry on, Wayne.
have I gone?
Carry on. No, carry on. We lost you for a moment.
That young people will actually. Am I back now?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So this research is showing that young people will actually live up to 37 miles outside of cities now in return for getting green space and access to green space. Now that could work in two ways. They're doing that because they want access to green space and all the things that the Wildlife Trust will promote, and which the people on here all want to happen, which is to value and for people to love the outdoors. But at the same time, it's also encouraging government to say, okay, young people now do want to live on the edges of towns, and unless we do something about that, we will see an acceleration of housing developments on the edge of town where you need a car, that are totally unsustainable, where people have to drive to shops. So this can go either way now, and it's going to need the public to act. It's going to need, obviously, bodies like yours to act, and it's going to need an awful lot of just badgering and marching in the streets, whatever it's going to need. And it's certainly going to need Emma's generation to be very, very vocal and to vote with their feet. I could go on, but I think I've said enough. It's a dangerous situation, but it's also a time of opportunity.
Great. Wayne, thank you very much. Well, at the Wildlife Trust, we certainly care about badgers, and we're pretty good at badgering as well. But Wayne, I do want to ask you a quick question. We've had one come in from Roger Wythe. He says, I live next to the Western Expansion area of Milton Keynes. He says, I have seen productive farmland turned into large estates. Do you think that developers are really building communities rather than just houses for sale? What's your sense of that?
Right. So yeah, the majority of the top house builders at the moment are still thinking about return on capital employed, and they're getting a 20% return, which is actually a bit obscene. They're thinking about shareholder value, and there's very little purpose and very little societal benefit in what they do. But there are developers, especially medium-sized ones, who do care and are becoming values-led, and it's up to the government and the planning system to start identifying developers who are starting to think about the things. And I'll name the name. The way that people like Persimmon have behaved over this last decade should mean that they come lower down the pecking order when it comes to being offered land, and it should be harder until they start to prove themselves that they're going on a better track. And they're not the only ones, but they haven't been. I see too many of their developments that need to change for the better.
Okay, thank you, Wayne, very much.
I hope I'm not going to get done for slander there, but you can save me, Wildlife Trust.
I don't know about that. I'm not going to make any commitments there, Wayne. But thanks very much for setting up this conversation. So we've heard tonight from all our speakers so far that it should be possible to do development in a way that actually is good for communities, that's beautiful, and that is good for wildlife as well. And London Wildlife Trust worked with Berkeley Homes in the creation of a new nature reserve, Woodby Wetlands, which is now, I know, a very precious reserve for lots of people living close to it, and one that I know people that go there very frequently and absolutely love it. Well, one of the people that went there recently was Prince William, and you might have seen it on the ITV programme that was shown just last week. Here's a clip.
So reed warblers come all the way from Africa to summer in Hackney.
For the local community here in Liverpool, looking onto this green space, I bet you ask everyone up there, they love the fact they can see this.
Oh God, like who wouldn't want a kingfisher darting past their kitchen window in the morning?
Fantastic.
10 years ago, David Mooney gave up his career as a science teacher to help give this 11-acre London reservoir a new lease of life.
With lots of amazing local people, volunteers, we planted reed beds, planted woodland, planted hedgerows, established wildflower meadows. From a barren, depressing reservoir with fences, keep out signs and barbed wire, we've literally wilded a corner of Hackney.
Great, thank you. Well, didn't you enjoy that? It was nice to see Prince William out there enjoying nature in London with the London Wildlife Trust. Do put all your comments in. We're getting them flooding in tonight. I must say, Emma has been particularly popular. Sky Blue saying, Emma's talking a lot of sense. Shazzy says, we need an army of Emmas. So there you go, Emma, you can feel reassured. Oh, Rachel Richards said, beautifully said, Emma. So what you said went down very, very well, Emma. Thank you for that. Let's hear now from Rebecca Taylor, who's an architect at JTP, and clearly we've been hearing already tonight from Wayne, from Roger, from Emma, that we're going to need to build beautiful in the future, and that good architecture is going to be crucial, just not just for buildings that look beautiful, but for creating communities and doing it in harmony with nature. So Rebecca, share with us your experience about how to do that, and what do you think the proposed reforms, as someone from within the architecture industry, what do you think of them at the moment, and why do you think, you know, a holistic approach is important?
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, it's certainly an exciting time for planning. You know, reform is coming, and I think most of us agree that the planning system has got flaws and there's room for improvement. I think we would all welcome a simpler, faster, and ultimately more predictable system. But I think the big issues with the white paper, as I've been sort of interrogating it, is actually the information that's not there, really. There seems to be a huge amount of detail missing. And so we're clear on what the ambitions are, perhaps, but it really doesn't seem to be very clear about how they're going to be achieved. And I think also there seems to be this unresolved tension, really, between the ambitions for deregulation and, you know, simplification in order to achieve this build. But you know, will that ultimately create a race to the bottom? Will that deliver quality, or will that actually lower quality? And I think there's some of the concerns that I have, and certainly JTP have. So if we just start with the bigger picture, I suppose, about where housing is needed and how much is needed. And the white paper is proposing, you know, top-down targets based on where the affordability pressure is across the country. Well, I think this is quite a reactive approach, and also quite a blunt instrument for deciding where new housing goes. I think we potentially need a more regional strategy that's informed by the local knowledge of housing needs. And of course, as Wayne's articulated, this is changing rapidly due to COVID. You know, there is the rush out of the city, the rush to the coastal areas. And so these patterns of movement are really changing, and housing demand is going to be changing. And what this regional approach also has the opportunity to do is potentially rebalance some of the prosperity divide between the north and the south, which is triggering some of these pressures on housing need. I think also then, if you're looking at a regional approach, you can parallel that with regional strategies on infrastructure, on, you know, wildlife and biodiversity, of course, employment, things like water that Emma's touched on, floodplains. You know, we can have this approach at a regional level, and we work with the Wildlife Trust on a project called 100 Miles Wilder across the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, which did exactly this and sought to reverse the usual hierarchy of influences that might determine where development should go, and create a landscape and nature-led approach as to where we might build in the Oxcam corridor. And it's sort of turning this on its head that we think is really exciting. That kind of work at that level could feed into local plans and help local authorities then to develop the visions for their areas and their towns, and work with their communities then to allocate housing in the right way within that kind of network. The current system is what's called a call for sites approach. So land promoters can take forward land and promote it through the planning system. This seems to be looking to be continued. They retermed it as the call for suggestions, but ultimately it is, I think it's a flawed approach, and it's leading to development, as Wayne said, in the wrong places that is unsustainable and is dependent on the car to get to shops, to get to schools. And so I think this call to sites or call to suggestions is something that we really need to challenge. So then a few thoughts on the zoning, which has been mentioned. I do support the simplified planning zones. And as you said, there are ways in countries in Europe where this is working. And I think that standardisation across local authorities potentially could be really good. I think the growth zones pose different challenges to the renewal zones. And perhaps the growth zones offer opportunities to encourage wildlife more deeply into our settlements and onto our doorstep, which is what we've all been craving more recently. And I think these the sort of zoning that is put forward actually is slightly contrary to the connections which Roger's articulated, the importance of connecting these zones together. So we need to not only have zones, but we need to have these green connections between them. So I think I'm wondering whether there's a more blended approach where we can deliver these growth areas with these connections that work with the nature recovery network. And that's something I'm quite excited about. So then you've also touched on beauty, the second pillar, as they call it in the white paper. I'm going to be a bit contentious and say I'm not necessarily in favour of this. I think it's challenging, who decides what is beautiful, and are we running the risk of entering into a long and protracted debate about style? And I think then if there's this ambition for fast tracking projects for beauty. So, some level of aesthetic judgment is needed by local authorities to assess whether something is beautiful. And I think we've already touched on, there's been this sort of departure of design professionals from local authorities. And that's a real problem. They're woefully under-resourced, and we need to, reinstall our local authorities with design champions and design experts who have the ability to judge this. So I guess it's just a question, is the beauty debate, is it helpful, or is it, does it run the risk of being a bit of a distraction? Then briefly on sustainability, I think we could go on a long time about this, but I was surprised in the white paper there isn't reference to the 15-minute city concept that the Parisian mayor has put forward, walkable neighbourhoods. Why aren't we designing new, these growth areas in particular, to be walkable and, supporting active travel and low carbon living? And why aren't we designing less reliance on the car? So I think there's a kind of missing gap there within some of the sustainability ambitions. And then finally, just to touch on community engagement as a practice, JTP, we love working with communities. We see immense value in it, and we work with lots of communities to develop shared visions for the places in which they live. And I think it's very difficult to imagine engaging with people at a very early stage. I think we find in our experience, people more actively get involved when they are working on something that is credible and fruitful. And will that really work at the early stages? And how does that work on design codes as well? And there's certainly a concern that in removing the ability for people to comment on detailed planning applications, that there's a risk we close down community participation at that stage, which I think is really problematic. So in summary, I welcome the reform, but I think we need reform that prioritises development, that improves people's lives ultimately, and also the health of our natural world. It's not just project build, build, build.
Thanks, Rebecca. And just to explain to people, for people that haven't read the white paper, it's proposing 3 zones. I mean, we're hearing more about this from Simon at the moment, but proposing 3 zones. One which would be called growth, one which is called renewal, and one which is called protect. So those are the 3 zones that kind of Rebecca was referring to there. But we'll hear more about that as the discussion goes, for sure. Rebecca, we've had a question coming from Paz Megroff saying, what challenges and innovations have you found in balancing the creation and maintenance of habitats for humans and wildlife?
So I think there's quite a lot about how you integrate them comfortably into new neighbourhoods. But I think what we have been learning, and that this is working with people like David Mooney, who was on the video previously, is that there's really creative ways of doing that. And actually, you don't need a huge amount of space. I think you can bring in green corridors, and you can use, rooftops are a huge asset, particularly in what might be these renewal areas, urban areas. The roofscape becomes really key. And also just sort of edges and pocket areas and doorstep areas. I think there's ways and means of bringing in wildlife, and actually it's also quite good because it's generally landscape that's low maintenance, and for developers that's attractive as well.
Great, thank you very much. Well, a lot of the discussion so far has talked about how nature can be brought close to where people live around housing developments, but of course actually we need nature close to where people undertake other activities, not least shopping centres and so on. And where the Wildlife Trust has worked with developers, one place has been in Rushton Lakes Shopping Centre to create a new nature reserve in the Nene Valley in North Cambridgeshire. Here's a film.
I'm TC, flying historian of Rushton Lakes, Britain's most radical nature reserve. These lakes were once a right old mess. Yeah, hard to think that these were gravel pits. A dumping ground for off-road racing and burnt-out cars. Look at it now. Wildlife is rampant. Trees are back from the dead. You can smell flowers and coffee, not fumes and trash. And the only screech you can hear, shh, is an owl. 220 acres brought back to life by my pals, the Wildlife Trust. Here's their sassy new visitor centre. From here, you can explore the Nen Wetlands Super Nature Reserve for miles beyond.
So the whole reason we're having this wildlife tonight is because of the government's proposals for planning reform as set out in a white paper that some of you would have seen, others not, but it's there if you want to try and find it on the internet. But that's what's caused a big stir amongst the people that really follow these issues closely. I'm delighted that tonight we're joined by Simon Gallagher, who's the Director of Planning at Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, the most senior civil servant really, looking at these issues and actually having to prepare the government's response and to the consultation around the white paper and indeed the thinking about how we go forward. So we have to be fair. Simon's not a politician, he's a civil servant, and I won't hold him to account for all the things that politicians have said. But Simon, you understand that a lot of the confusion about this is that in the summer we had the Prime Minister saying what we need is project speed and we need build, build, build. And the white paper comes out and talks about how we're going to build beautiful and sustainable. How can it do both of those?
Craig, thanks for having me on, and really good to be here and really good to have a chance to talk to people. It's a really important agenda. Look, the answer is, and we've set this out in the white paper, this is about both, and it's actually about more as well. So yes, this is an agenda which is about building more homes and meeting the government's manifesto commitment to build a credit market that builds 300,000 homes a year, so that people like Emma, who've spoken passionately and really effectively about that, they're getting the homes they need. But that doesn't mean we can't also have the second objective there, which is actually to build better designed, better beautiful, better, more engaging with the local community designed properties. And that is an objective there. You know, the level of satisfaction with the current design of properties from all aspects of that, from the performance of those, the energy efficiency through on, is not quite where it needs to be. So we can be ambitious in there. But I think also, and you know, Craig, if I can pick you up, you painted a picture of two objectives there. The government was also clear it had a third objective around improving the environmental effect of planning. You know, planning has done a reasonable job in some places of protecting environment, but actually the government's ambitions are much more ambitious than just to protect a few places. It's actually to deliver some of the environmental renewal you talked about at the start. And we need a different sort of planning system to do that. So there are three objectives in there. And then if I can bring in three more that we've also put into the white paper, is one is we are unapologetic. We want to put a planning system that delivers things faster. The effect of a planning system which is slow is really that some of those smaller builders and some of those values-based builders that Wayne was talking about earlier find it harder to get into the market. They can't take the capital cost of having applications running for years and years. And so the government is clear about getting speed, partly so it can get get a broader range of participants into the market. It's also really clear on certainty, and it was so good to hear what Roger had to say at the start, because that's exactly, in a sense, what Roger was talking about is the model for what's in the white paper. That at the moment, developers find it uncertain what they're going to be asked for, and they value something where you can get codes and rules which are worked up with local people and local organisations such as Wildlife Trust, which helps people navigate the system. But also the communities really value that. So at the moment, one of the big problems we've got is the developer might sign up to something and the community isn't sure it'll actually happen. And often they worry that they haven't got it in the end. We're in a much more binding system. And then the final bit is to get actually better accessibility and engagement. You know, Craig, the fact that you had to be quite apologetic about planning at the start of this actually says it all. This can be, this is something which it affects your communities, it affects all the people around there. How can we make this more engaging? Lots of, planning applications are not the most user-friendly document. You have to know what you're doing looking at those. Those are long documents, really hard to get people who are haven't got the time and the availability to do that. They are paper-based documentation. We can do better. We can make these more digital. We can get these in a format which actually helps the community to engage and which makes planning much more democratic. And the one bit I just want to pick up on a couple of bits there is we want to maintain a local process. So there's a lot of calls for the government to do things, and that's absolutely fine, and we're big enough to take that. But also, the planning system in this country is very much devolved to your local authorities. It's the local authority who sets the game and the rules in each area. We wanted that to carry on, and for those to be the people who they're the closest to the area. Those are the people who have the skills, the knowledge, and the democratic locus to set the priorities in their areas.
Okay, Simon, thank you very much. Just to be clear, I mean, we've had a question from Donna Potts. How can members of the public campaign or raise objections during the consultation process successfully?
So we are consulting up until the 29th of October. There is available on the website, gov.uk. If you put planning white paper in there, planning white paper 2020, you'll find a way through to that. Get your consultation responses in. We're looking forward to hearing that. My team have informed me we've got quite a lot already coming in, so definitely get me your views in by then. I think it's quite important that the government hears all views on this. There are lots of views coming in from local government. We've done a lot of engagement, and I hope my minister's been out and about talking to various events, and we really want to hear things. But the thing I would always say is don't just sort of, I find what is more useful is actually the conversations like this, like the ones we've had with other members of the Wildlife Trust. Those have been the most useful bits because you get the richness of the discussion. But yes, please do get your responses in to the link, and if you can use the electronic form there, it's much easier for us to process those, and we can catch your views much clearer.
So let me, in that consultation then, in that conversation, Simon, let me put a couple of questions to you that would have been raised. Two of the big themes that have come out in the public debate on this over the last couple of months or so on. One is the big issue around local democracy. The argument is that the planning consultation is saying it wants to involve people early on at the kind of plan level, but actually the argument is that the ability for people to get involved at the project level is being taken away. That's the argument that's being made, and that's why I read that quote from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at the start. You should have got involved 50 years ago when the proposals were up in Alpha Centauri. But when it comes to that detailed phase, a lot of people get engaged in planning issues actually when a proposal comes in for a bit of land right next to them. Do you think the government is heading to increase or decrease the ability for people to get involved at that stage?
So overall, what we wanted to get is better and earlier and swifter engagement of the right bits. And Roger made the point earlier that often by the time you've got the detailed planning application in, a lot of the principles of how that land is used have already been settled, and so it is quite a frustrating process for the community there. If it was within the current system, I'd be quite worried about it. But in a system where the community is setting the design codes, the rules of the game for those areas, actually, that's quite a powerful tool for the community to shape the development in their area, and for us to get a better balance between the interests in the community. So I'm not convinced it is any weakening of the democracy there. In fact, and if we can combine this with what we talked a lot about in the white paper around better digital engagement, we should be able to get broader engagement. Yes, there is quite a bit of engagement on individual applications, but if you look at the facts on this, it's not always the broadest and most representative group in the community. It's really tough for younger people. They're not expecting to read a 200-page document that is available only in hard copy as a PDF file. They're wanting to get something on their smartphones, which is a bit clearer. If we can get that better engaging, I think we can get better engagement and a higher quality engagement at that earlier stage. And look, the proposal is that if a piece of development comes forward which is not inside the rules that the community have shaped for themselves, then the community can consider that as they would do now as out of that. So the community's in control in this model.
Okay, and the other issue that obviously has received a lot of attention is this suggestion of the use of an algorithm to try and help decide where the different zones are and so on. Now, this is very curious, isn't it? You know, we just had 2-3 years ago, there was a certain slogan called "Take Back Control," got quite a lot of attention one way and another. Did all that happen so that now decisions over the most important issues close to where people live get handed over to an algorithm?
So that is absolutely not the proposal. So there's quite a bit of confusion about this. So in the short term, we have a formula which helps local authorities work out what is the starting point for planning in their areas, and it's called local housing need, and it works some numbers. We've proposed updating that. We revise it every couple of years, and that's what's in this. There is then a separate proposal for that. But to be clear, that's about numbers. It's not about the quality. It's not what types of housing. It's not about where. And what we want to do is to encourage the planning process in local government to be about the quality, the design, the types of homes. How do you make the great places? How do you get into the nature? Rather than being a debate about how many homes in any area, and can we help plan making get through that? You know, if you look at the work of people who've looked at plan making, we had our local plans expert group on this a few years ago. Too many plans were getting bogged down in the process of debating what is the number in the area. If we can come up with a standard method for working out what roughly the homes are or the starting point for planning is, then you can actually get the community to actually focus on the key issues. You know, remember that, you know, one of the big problems at the moment we've got about plans, which, you know, those of us who are into planning, but apologies for those of you who are not experts, the plan should be the starting point for decisions in an area. It provides the framework for decisions, and it's what the community has decided. It's produced by the local authority. You know, what we've got is those plans are taking 7 years on average to produce, which means that, you know, why would you get involved and engage in that process? It's just going to take too long. It's too drawn out. And just under half the country does not have an up-to-date plan. It has not produced one within the last 5 years. This is a real problem. If we're going to give communities confidence about the development in their area and give clarity to developers about where they can build, we need to get these plans in place, up to date, and which means coming up with a swifter process to get those plans produced.
Thank you. So questions for Wayne, Rebecca, Emma, Roger. Are you reassured? Wayne.
Well, in a way, we've been working on a project in Blackburn called Blackburn Green Hills, and we heard I got an email during this session that we're on from the developer there that they've just got a tranche of money to help them as an SME, a pretty small developer, to proceed to. And that's the money's come from Homes England, and the view is that that's to support SMEs. So that is fantastic, because we do need small and medium developers, because if you can get local developers working on local developments, there's a saying that I'm sure it's not just a Lancashire saying, and I'll be careful how I say it, but you don't SH !T on your own doorstep, do you? And remember that a lot of the big developers don't have their own doorstep, and they go around and they get on site and get off site. So I think local developers is really important, and it's really good to hear Homes England supporting them. But there is one thing that we haven't got that we did have. So from up until around about 2010, when the current Conservative, well, not the current Conservative government, when it went from Labour to Conservative, there was something called the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, and I was part of that. So, and it was funded by central government, but it was funded to hold them to account, to hold planning to account, and to hold developers to account. And it was in my view, it was doing a wonderful job for society. But that was burned in the bonfire of the Quangos. That's what they called it. When the Cameron government came in, they got rid of what was considered to be Quangos, and CABE was reduced to a minuscule version of what it was. And since then, we've definitely seen Well, without a doubt, we've seen profits go up in some of the larger, more unscrupulous developers, but we've also definitely seen a kind of a downward trend on what planning is able to do to prevent things going wrong. So it would be great if Homes England could campaign for something like CABE to come back, because CABE would be a wonderful supporter, would have been a wonderful supporter of the Wildlife Trust.
And Wayne, it's a brilliant point, and I should have said something about that. In that my Secretary of State has been really pushing the design agenda, and one of the things he's announced is some steering groups to actually form the basis to start doing some of this role exactly that you want, because he is passionate on the design agenda. I've heard him many times, and we're really trying to get some of that agenda and create the infrastructure around things which will actually really drive that work. So thank you for bringing that back. I should have mentioned something about that.
So Roger, Rebecca, Emma, any further thoughts that came into your mind as you were hearing Simon talking about the consultation?
I just wonder, Craig, if there's
Go ahead.
Yeah. I just wonder if there's something that we haven't raised, and I don't want to sound too nerdy about this, but I think being nerdy about planning is kind of at the heart of it. And there's something about data and evidence that is really, really critical. And I think especially in the zoning, and I think it might not be as clear in what we've said so far, but one of the things that's suggested in this growth zone, so where development's got kind of an easier passage, is that in a sense, we won't be requiring developers to undertake site surveys to find out what's on the land that they'll be developing. So we will start building houses or building new infrastructure without having any idea what's on those sites. And I think that's okay if you've got really rich data about what's the ecology of that area and the ecology of that growth zone. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say that there's a fairly poor show in terms of having data invested in terms of what's happening on the ground. And sometimes site surveys, when people are doing planning, are the first time we get to find out what's on that land. And so I think the zoning approach can't really happen until you've got accurate and up-to-date and extensive nature data. And I think the government's proposals in another department, in DEFRA for nature recovery networks, are fantastic, but they're going to need to be resourced. They're going to need to be up-to-date, as you say, Simon, just so that they can kind of really chime with what's happening. But I can't sort of emphasize enough really that the importance of understanding what's in a patch, both to shape where these zones happen, but also in the growth zone in particular, but I think also in the renewal zone to help inform what's important about where development happens in those spaces.
Rebecca, can I just bring Rebecca in as well now,
Yeah, it's just to pick up on the community engagement point, really, because I think your point, Simon, about using more digital technology, and I mean it's been fascinating really the last 6 months, all the community engagement that we've done online. We have tapped into quite a different audience, and I think that's exciting. Of course, we lose another sector of that audience that was normally very well attended when we were holding community planning events and that sort of thing in person, and I think we do have to focus on those hard to reach groups. Absolutely. So I think there's definitely opportunity there. I think the concern we have is that certainly the processes we run, whether you call them inquiry by design processes, charrette process, this sort of thing, they're visioning processes that bring a community together about a particular proposal. And we do that at very early stages, and that's the opportunities to create these big green connections and these missing links and all those desire lines and things that local communities know so well. And I guess my concern is that the proposals seem to somewhat leapfrog that kind of visioning stage, because they're early on and then they miss the opportunity later. So I was just interested to get your views on that.
Simon.
Gosh, there's a lot in there, and one of the reasons we've done quite Rebecca, you picked me up on sort of lack of detail in the white paper, and you're absolutely spot on that, but that's deliberate in a sense to try and create some space to try and fill it with some of these ideas. And the bit, it goes back to my bit earlier, which is I want to create space for innovation and for the right things in the right local authorities, for the right projects and the right things. And others know that the sort of engagement and the sort of design process you need for some sites is different from others, and you can use similar principles, but you need to do that. And the bit I want to be a bit careful of from the national government's end of things is quite over prescription of how all those should play out. We know we want world-class community engagement, but I suspect the least good people at prescribing exactly what that is national law and regulation. And so some of that can happen and be innovative. One of the things, and I sort of fascinating on Roger's point there about the lack of data, which links to these, is one of the things we haven't got very good in planning in England is the data and the learning processes where we've got this brilliant laboratory of planning working in 300 plus local authorities across the country, and the fusion of ideas that across those is less good than you would expect actually from there, partly because of the system. And I suspect actually, the Wildlife Trusts are much better at learning from each other about what really works in areas. And I think that's something that we need to get better at in English planning, about cascading the great practice that happens in some places around Britain.
So Emma, you've been hearing this debate. Are you reassured? Do you feel this is going the right way? Are you confident that you're going to get beautiful and sustainable building in the future?
Maybe to an extent, yes. I don't want to entirely dismiss the white paper. But what instantly happens when I think of devolution and putting it into local control is inequality. The wealth distribution across the UK is not equitable by any stretch of the imagination. And as soon as you devolve things, you're then going to get local areas where there's going to be a low percentage of people involved in this because it isn't accessible. If you're not taught about kind of building, if you're not taught about that sort of things, nobody's going to be able to engage in it. And my worry would be that in poorer areas where people aren't as in the know or aren't as willing to get involved in something like this because they're intimidated, because it's never been something that's been accessible before and they just don't feel confident enough to do that. I'd worried that in those areas that might be exploited because people can get easier permission, or whether there'll be a centralised regulation on that to ensure that areas that do have a lower income, whether they'll be lifted up, because in a sense, if we want a future with climate justice, we need social justice, and that cannot be there without a centralised aspect that's ensuring that certain local areas are getting more support than others to achieve equity, and to an extent that needs centralised government control. So whilst I can see there's an aspect for local areas to ensure that there is that community action, there would need to be something from the government as well to ensure this sort of equity-based system that young people in my generation would love to see in the future.
Really good comments, useful comments there, Emma. In fact, they chime with some of the comments that have come in from you, the audience tonight, particularly looking at issues around, the digital consultation. We had Elizabeth Wainwright saying, I'm a district councillor. Many don't have broadband access. We do need better digital access, but many people still rely on notices on lampposts. Roberta and Antonici, I'm not convinced that digital engagement responds fully to young people's need for engagement. And actually comments from quite a few of you here that are saying similar things is that, yes, of course we need to use digital approaches, but we can't just rely on those for good engagement. Well, it's worth saying, obviously this is a topic that has caused a lot of response over the last few months, and central to it has been, as you'd expect, the Town and Country Planning Association. We did invite them to speak tonight. They really wanted to, but they were unable to do so. But I'm delighted that Hugh Ellis from the Town and Country Planning Association has sent us this video.
So this is a really extraordinary time for the planet, given everything we now know about the threats to biodiversity and our kind of treatment of the natural world. I think the first proposition is that planning is enormously powerful in helping solve this problem. It's not exercising that potential in the right way yet, so no one's arguing that change isn't necessary. We need a system that's much more focused on the objective of sustainable development, and then underneath that, how it delivers for people and the natural environment and the promotion of biodiversity. I have to say, frankly, though, that I cannot see at the moment how the planning white paper takes us forward on that journey. Partly because the planning white paper is a sketch document which doesn't provide the detail to reassure us that actually wildlife biodiversity promotion is core to that. Yes, of course, there's good rhetoric, but that simply isn't good enough. What we actually need to do is to test this new system which is a radical departure from the system we have now. But we need to make sure we've tested that system, beta versions, if you like, played out case studies, and explored whether or not it really will deliver for nature conservation. Some aspects, I think, remain extremely difficult. Moving to a new environmental assessment regime, we don't know the details of that, so we have to trust, do we, that will be okay. And we can't see the detail of what will be in design codes, how that will deal with wildlife. And there still remain many unanswered questions about net gain, particularly people's relationship with their local environment and how that will be recognised. And we shouldn't underestimate, I think, the gap between people and the planning process, and we don't want to see anything that makes that work. So for the TCPA, I think what we need here is a process. This wasn't a white paper, it was a green paper, and I think the real commitment we need from government is to work through, to have a really important and inclusive work stream on how the planning system can address the needs of wildlife and biodiversity really successfully. From a TCPA point of view, planning is so critically important at a time of climate crisis, but the white paper has a long way to go before it provides the right kind of platform for a sustainable future.
So Simon was telling us earlier about how there's already many responses have come into the government's consultation on planning, and you can do that too. You can get involved. And at the Wildlife Trust, we've tried to make it as easy as possible for you. So there has been a link put in the comment box on YouTube tonight. As you're watching this, you'll see it also on the strap line below the screen. You can find it also at the Wildlife Trust's website under the title Rewild the Planning System. And thousands of you, over 8,000 people, have already submitted responses via the Wildlife Trust to the consultation to make sure that nature's recovery should be put at the heart of any changes to the planning system. And in fact, we've had a lot of questions in tonight about something called biodiversity net gain. One question from a journalist, James, at the ENDS report has asked the question, just how important is biodiversity net gain to the government? But first of all, Roger, I wonder if you can explain what biodiversity net gain is, because not everyone will be 100% clear.
Yeah, no, it's a concept I think that's good. We're going to hear a lot more about as it becomes into law, fingers crossed, in the Environment Act. And put simply, I guess it means that that after a development, the biodiversity on a site is measurably better as a result of the development, rather than being harmed. So when a development happens, the environment benefits from that. Now, there's a classic, and there's a nice story. One of the academics who we were working with when we worked on Building in Nature tells this kind of funny story that's gone around, which is a kind of like, you know, like the question is, how do you improve the quality of your average English arable field? And the answer is, you put a housing estate on it. And I think there's some quite interesting stuff there that actually making such a place better for nature can often be part and parcel of development happening in that place. And so one of the things, there's a bit of jargon called the mitigation hierarchy, which I think is just worth explaining. So fundamentally, we want to see that offset for, if you like, that how do you compensate the obviously some nature's going to be harmed by a building, but mostly we want to see that compensated for on the development. So the mitigation hierarchy sort of goes avoid or minimize, which that makes loads of sense. Then you get into rectify and reduce, and at the end of the right at the pinnacle of the things we least want to see is offset. So if you can't, and in very tight spaces, you can't produce net gain on site, so you need to find other land where you can improve the outcomes for nature. So it's not a very good nutshell, but it's quite a big nutshell, but I hope that helps.
But a critical principle, isn't it, that the net gain should be as close as possible to that development. You know, it's no good doing it 10 miles away, really. It's not going to do the same thing. So, Simon, let me ask you, I mean, we have had a lot of questions coming on that tonight. As I said, one journalist from ENDS report has said, how important is biodiversity net gain to the government? You know, do you think as a result of this, when the planning reforms comes through, will it require all development to deliver biodiversity net gain?
So this is really important. This is something, as Roger said, this is in the Environment Bill, which is currently before Parliament. My team have worked really closely with our friends at DEFRA and with the people who we've been working with, including with Wildlife Trust, to get some ideas on to get that working. It is a new process in law. But I think it's going to be really powerful both in terms of actually simplifying things for developers, because they'll actually know what the game is there. Being clear to the community on what's actually going to happen, but also just actually being able to assure that we are actually getting biodiversity out of development. And there are lots of different things. I think there's going to be lots of detailed work to be done to actually work out precisely how this works in every single instance. But I think this is a really powerful tool, which we want. The government wants, as I said at the start, it wants more development, but it also wants better environmental outcomes. And that is, we don't think that's a contradiction. Roger's example, I'm not sure I'd be so cheeky as to put that in, is an example that there are ways of doing that. And there are some really quite innovative ways in that. And if we can give a clear expectation to developers that that's what they need to plan for, then the likes of Rebecca, who are the clever end of this, who can actually think about the site design and how to do it, can actually come up with those options, but they know what they're doing from the start, and there's a clear expectation for the developer. It's really tough on the developer. They've got a site plan and they do this, and they come to the local authority, and at the end, then they're saying, well, how are we going to deal with this? Know it up front, then they can start planning it in.
Great, thank you. So, often in the public political debate, often the planning system is kind of framed as the block on development, the reason houses aren't being built. But we've had questions coming in from a number of you this evening, rather, pointing out that actually, as of tonight, there is planning permission for 1 million homes in this country, and they're not being built. Pamela Buchanan has said that point. More than 1 million homes approved, but unbuilt. Planning is not the bottleneck. Elizabeth Wainwright says 90% of planning applications are currently approved, but permission lapses. A big issue is speculation and drip feeding land into the system, not the slowness of local authorities. Rebecca, Wayne, can you shed some light on this for us?
Rebecca, do you want to go first or me?
Go ahead, Wayne.
Well, the lady that said that drip feeding is absolutely right. It serves the industry to drip feed. If you can, building less but building profitably is genuinely what a business would want to do. If you can keep your margins, your return on capital employed, your ROS as it's called, at around 20%, then that helps you borrow. It's great for shareholders. And there is one really easy way to do that, and Homes England, could help with this. And let's say you get a development of 500 homes, which is a reasonable size development for a largish developer to take. What they will often do is they will take that development, but if they were forced, if it wasn't given to a single developer, and that was given to, let's say, 2 national developers and 5 or 6 regional developers, the regional developers would be happy to develop 50 homes. The national developers should be allowed to develop 100 homes. They say that that's too few, but that's not true at all. Then you would get competition. Most of them could start to develop at once. They would be in competition for quality. We've talked about quality earlier. They would be in competition for speed. They would be in competition for the ones who could give the nicest gardens with the best wildlife facilities, or all of that kind of stuff. And that is what happens in Northern Europe, where you don't get as much NIMBY against new housing, so that housing is built for Emma's generation, because there you have true competition. And whilst it's not, in my view, what we have in this country on a lot of developments is a quasi-monopoly, where developers get a chunk of land on one side of a town, and it might be the side of a town where people want to live, and basically they're allowed to deliver it as slow as they like. There is nothing to say you have to deliver at such and such a speed. And that could be changed. It could easily be changed, certainly on the land that Homes England and other government bodies own. I don't know, Rebecca, what you think of that.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add that on, I think some of these big sites, we've got a few at 3,000 up to sort of 5,000 homes. I think there's only a certain pace at which they can go because of the infrastructure that's got to be delivered in parallel with the dwellings. And I think sometimes that's the problem. But I absolutely agree that there's lots of funding now coming through from the likes of Homes England and the housing delivery funds and things, which are accelerating these.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Yeah, and if central government and central bodies can put that infrastructure up front, that leaves no excuse. And yes, it is expensive for developers to build the roads, to put all the infrastructure in at the beginning, which you need to do, and to build the schools. But if that can be funded from central government, and having seen what is possible in terms of funding during COVID, for too long it's been said we can't afford to do that. Well, the money the magic money tree has been found, hasn't it? We now know that this government is capable and willing to borrow for the public good, and if there isn't much more public good than the places that we live and how we treat precious land in the UK. So for me now, they've proved their method. They've proved that they're capable of borrowing for the public good. Let's get on with it. Let's get on with it now.
Okay, so we could spend the night talking about biodiversity net gain, and particularly if that's magic money trees as the form of biodiversity, that would be interesting. But it's worth saying, there's quite a lot of scepticism coming in around biodiversity net gain tonight. We've had Roger Knowles saying offsetting biodiversity net gain is just another way of ignoring biodiversity. Lawrence Rose said it guarantees net loss in the mitigation hierarchy if it isn't applied with the utmost rigour. So it's a fairy story. So there is a debate we could carry about biodiversity net gain all night, I reckon. But there's also another comment come in. Dan Papworth has said the Wildlife Trust proposal of Wild Belt is vital because we need to allow some areas to be left undisturbed for centuries in order to regain the lost biodiversity for the past few decades. Roger, what is this Wildlife Trust proposal of Wild Belt? I know nothing of it.
You complain too much. No, I think it's a great idea. I think I mentioned that idea that there was a missing zone, and I think Simon, you mentioned about the ambition being beyond protection, and I think that's great. So I think let's see, which hints for me that where's the zone for recovery. So I think the protection zone probably isn't enough if we're faced with a biodiversity emergency and with biodiversity and climate emergency. So we do need, and this is where our in a sense Craig has rolled a ball into this debate, which says actually if we're serious about nature's recovery, and at the Wildlife Trust we've had this figure of 30% of land dedicated to nature's restoration by 2030. If we want to deliver that, and I think we know there's huge public support for an ambitious goal like that, we probably need in these reforms to reflect how that's going to happen. I think we've touched on nature recovery, network mapping, and other mapping that can tell us where these zones are going to be, but they could also tell us where the best opportunities for nature's recovery are. And so that's the idea. I think we're working through some of the detail. We're working through whether it works completely separately, as the person who put the question forward said, whether it is a kind of completely rewilded zone, completely bereft of communities. Although I think one more exciting thing perhaps to think about is how people in nature and nature's restoration can work alongside each other, and we can have zones working through our towns and cities which are part of the wild belt.
So Emma, what would be your vision for the future? Actually, if you close your eyes and imagine yourself, living in a house in 2050 in a new development, just paint the picture for us. What does it look like? What's going on around you? What would you like to imagine?
Honestly, you'd be surprised how much to think about this. As a climate activist, it can be such like a pessimistic atmosphere. So you have to find so much hope in things like this, about imagining a future where all of these ideas that are being thrown around, like the environment sector, come to life. And in the end, it's something where humans and the environment exist in harmony, as opposed to trying to dominate each other. So much we're sort of thought as two separate entities, where you've got housing and you've got nature, and we separate them, but that shouldn't be what's happening. We should try and interlink the two. We need to try and coexist in that sense, because we've seen that humans prosper when they're around nature. So it's doing no one any good to separate the two. And I'd just love to have houses that are surrounded by greenery and surrounded by kind of nature that's wild. It doesn't have to be this sort of uniformed, aesthetically pleasing nature. It can be just what it is in its purest form. And I think so often we try so hard to make it look good, to make it aesthetically pleasing, to make it this and that. And in a sense, all that we want is to be able to coexist in a place that is beneficial for the environment and beneficial for us. And we need to try and prioritise that, and to realise that we need to stop trying to make things so rigid and to make them fit in this box that nature doesn't. And we need to stop going about that, because it's never going to be an efficient way to do it. And so I hope that in the future, development and planning becomes more of a fluid thing, where nature can thrive in a way that we don't try and fit it into our plans, whereas we plan around nature.
Brilliant, thank you. And what about the kind of involvement, locals, people's involvement, democracy, engagement in all of this? How do you see that? What would be your dream of how you would see that in 2050, say?
I definitely think we need an equitable way for people to have a say. It needs to be a way in which it's accessible for people, because like I said, I'm 16. My knowledge on development and planning is somewhat very limited. But having an accessible way where people don't need to have a degree in this sort of thing, but they can understand what impact it's going to have on their local area, and to then say, yes, this is going to be beneficial, or no, it's not. And to feed back to these people who are going to develop and say, you could do this. It needs to be like this open flow of communication where people feel there's an accessible way that their voice can be heard. Because so often people don't vote because it's intimidating, because there isn't enough education around it. And we need to break down those barriers for people, because we can't expect people to do it themselves. We need to make this relationship between development and the community more fluid, because in a sense we can't kind of make the community do that for them. It needs to be the developer's role to help make that bridge.
Great, thank you. Well, as ever, all our best plans hit the clock, and as ever with Wildlife, we are finding ourselves coming up to the end of this broadcast, even though it feels like we've spent not nearly enough time on this. So I'm going to come to each of you on the panel with one same question, because earlier we had Simon saying we need to bring planning back to the heroic realm, I think is what you said, Simon, something like that. Was it that?
I think that was Wayne said that.
Oh, Wayne said it.
I'm going to take credit for Wayne's inspired words.
Well, I love those words, Wayne. Thank you very much. We need to bring planning back to the heroic realm. So please give me, each of you, just as we close tonight, 2-3 sentences. What needs to happen to bring planning back to the heroic realm? How would you summarise it? And I'll come to you last, Wayne, since they were your words. But Roger, what do we need to do?
I think for me, there's a fantastic quote when, I don't know if anyone remember when, David Attenborough, Top of the Shard, last episode of that, I think, Planet Earth series, where he talked about the biggest challenge facing humanity. And Emma, you're channeling a bit of David Attenborough on this one, because you said exactly the same thing, was about that we need to find new ways to coexist with nature, because the current formula is broken. And I think coexistence is my kind of, we've got to find a new formula for coexistence with nature, because what we've got don't work.
Rebecca, what do we need to do to bring planning back to the heroic realm?
It's a really good question, and I think there's a slight sort of feeling perhaps within certainly architectural circles, if you end up in a local authority, you perhaps you failed within the private sector. There's this sort of, and I wonder whether the things like the public practice initiative in London, where design professionals have been seconded into local authorities to sort of champion good design, and it's really elevated the status of the design sectors within local authorities. I think it's triggered quite a different outlook perhaps from designers within local authorities, and I think that's something that ought to be countrywide to help elevate planning and really raise its status ultimately in the role that it has and in the future.
Simon.
Gosh, it's a big question. And there is a great quote about make no small plans, be bold. And I think that is definitely at the heart of this. For me, it's about unlocking the power of this. Planning should not be the preserve of a small group. It needs to unlock the data, unlock the information so that planning can be a genuine thing which everyone can participate in. If we have planning as something which is too complicated, which is too specialized, which needs rarefied levels of knowledge, you're never going to make this heroic. We need to get the data, the information out there so that everybody can participate.
Thank you. Emma, what do we need to do to bring planning back to the heroic realm?
Again, that's a very, very big question, and one I think that's quite hard to conceptualize. I think we do need to have more information around it, more education about it, more inclusivity and more equity. It's such a difficult thing to understand, and this is the problem with so many issues in society, from politics to kind of development and everything in between. We need to start breaking down these barriers, because it shouldn't be a privilege to be able to have a say on these issues and to be able to shape your local community. And at the moment, it very much is a privileged position to be in, to be able to have a say in politics. And we need to break those barriers down for people, because we can't expect them to do that for themselves. We need to ensure that everyone can have a say, and that what we're building, for kind of what you're building as adults for my future, is one that represents what everyone wants in the community, not what just the kind of privileged people have the position and they want. And I really, really hope that kind of everyone watching this and all the adults out there can help make sure that the future that I take up, and the housing that I take up, and the developments and kind of the places where I can raise my children when I'm older, that they're interlinked with biodiversity, and that we don't lose that connection we've lost with nature now even more.
And thank you very much, Emma. And Wayne, you suggested it. What do we need to do to bring planning back to the heroic realm?
Well, we need to keep thinking of things that could possibly work. So an example is permitted development rights, which the idea was, to help our town centres, which are obviously losing retail and will continue to lose retail, and losing office space as well. Sorry, losing office occupation. That they'd have permitted development rights, and one of the things was that you could change offices into residential, and that the idea is that would benefit town centres. It would stop housing being built in unsuitable places, and people would live in a town centre, which is exactly right. But then there is no follow through on that. So what you get is a great example. Anybody listening to this, look up permitted development rights, look up Terminus House in Harlow, and then see if we actually got that, if we're actually getting what permitted development rights should do right, because planning has got no power then to stop it all going wrong, and greed keeps coming into it, and power keeps being given to unscrupulous developers. So we have to give planning power. We have to give a situation where a developer, some developers will have employees whose job is just to overturn planning. Their job is they have legal people working with them, and they're the most fated people within their business, because their job is simply to overturn and to defeat the planners. And that is just that and they win nearly every time.
Well, thank you very much, Wayne. Thank you to the whole panel tonight that have contributed to such a rich discussion. Thank you, Roger Mortlock, Chief Executive of Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. Thank you to Rebecca Taylor, architect. Thank you to Simon Gallagher, civil servant at the Ministry of Housing. Thank you to Emma Greenwood, Youth MP for Bury, and thank you to Wayne Hemingway of Hemingway Design. It's been a great discussion. This is such a complicated area. We could have carried on all night, in fact, all week, to carry on discussing these. But what we've tried to do at the Wildlife Trust is make it as simple as possible to cut through this complexity and enable you to have a voice in this consultation. So if you follow the links in the YouTube commentary, and if you go straight to our website, you'll see how you can respond to the government's consultation on planning. What we've summarised, and we think there's 5 principles that are needed to really make sure that planning puts nature in recovery. Number 1, the principle that wildlife recovery and easy access to nature for people are at the heart of these planning reforms. Number 2, that protections and standards are not weakened. Number 3, that we actually make more space for nature in all of this, and we suggest doing that through a new designation called Wildbelt. Number 4, democracy, that residents and other stakeholders can engage at all stages of the process to make sure that they can be informed and can inform building near where they live. And number 5, that decisions are based on accurate and up-to-date ecological data, noting that that changes over time as well. So you need to maintain that data and invest in that data. If you broadly agree with those principles, if you agree with the need to rewild the planning system, then go to the Wildlife Trust website or click the link and respond to the government consultation along those lines. But thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you to the panel. And just to remind you as we go out, we haven't even talked so much about health tonight either. Well, we're going to have close with some final words from the brilliant Dr. Amir Khan, who's an ambassador for wildlife. We haven't got it actually, a technical problem. We haven't got a video from Amir Khan. But Amir Khan, who's ambassador of the Wildlife Trust, has called on people to also respond to the consultation and how important planning is for nature and for people's health. Instead, we're going to close just with a big thank you from me to the panel. And of course, as ever, thank you to you for watching. Good night.